You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Martin Popoff, one of the world's leading journalists in the music world. He has written several books, including coffee table books on AC/DC, Aerosmith, Fleetwood Mac, and others. He's written articles about Rush, Metallica. I'm going to sit here and try to read this list as best I can. Montrose, Mahogany Rush, Frank Marno and Mahogany Rush. I haven't heard that in a while. But today we're talking about his new book, which I have purchased, read, and devoured and enjoyed, and that is Van Halen at 50. Mr. Popoff, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yes, thank you, Robert. Looking forward to this. Very cool.
Let's get right into it. It seems to me, based on not only this book, but reading some of your other articles, that writing about music and bands, artists, is a real labor, but it's also a real labor of love. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a pretty cool job. I never thought I'd end up doing this. Basically, back in 1993, I self-published a book of hard rock and heavy metal record reviews. And then after that, I got hooked up with a buddy of mine, Tim Henderson, and he started a heavy metal magazine. So that's when I fell into it, literally just fell into it in around 94 and started interviewing a lot of bands. I was a crazy music fan my whole life, but I never thought I'd be writing about this stuff. But that first record review book was really about just organizing all those thoughts and all those connections between all these bands and their albums in one place. And it was a satisfying exercise. And just after starting with the exercise sort of thing, that book came out through a proper publisher. And then there were a couple of bands where I thought, I've now interviewed these guys quite a few times. Maybe I could write a book on them. And it's basically the same funness or fun level of a job that a DJ would have, or anybody in the music industry who's not the actual musicians themselves, because on the old Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think being in the band would be a better part of being in the music industry. But it's literally, a lot of us do a lot of this stuff for free, and we do podcasts and YouTube shows and stuff, or run a fan club, for example. And It just feels like being a fan, right? So I have a job being a fan, essentially.
Most of the time when you write articles or write books like this one, Van Halen at 50, do you get a lot of cooperation from the management, from the band members themselves, or is it just vary depending on mood?
No, there's never any approach to any of the bands or management. I've done 130 books. I've not done that once. There's literally been, I don't know, 2 or 3 or 4 authorized biographies where you're working with them in some respect, but there's no really good incentive or reason to do that. I know there are people that do that, and the idea is that now you're working with the band and we all expect to apparently sell more copies. So there's a larger advance, and then the writer and the band split the advance. But I've never gone down that road, because you don't want to do all this work and then have it not happen for one reason or another. So literally, and then even after the fact, there's almost no acknowledgement between band and me that we've done. I've gone on and interviewed bands many times that I've written books on, and I don't bring it up that I've written a book on them, and they don't bring it up. And sometimes you even wonder if they know. And then eventually you find out that they know a lot about you, possibly, right? They've got a few of your books and stuff like that. So no, there's a whole lot of reasons not to even bother with any of that. It just seems like a big bother.
And the hope is obviously the closer you get to a band or a band member, the more inside sort of knowledge and information and stories you receive, which would make the reader, you would think, more interested in what you had to write. And there's very few bands who have the history that Van Halen does, not only in terms of performance and success, but also intra-party drama.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. There is a lot of drama, and they're a secretive band as well. On the topic of what I just mentioned, a buddy of mine, Stephen Rosen, had back in the 80s gone through all this work of doing all these interviews with Eddie Van Halen and putting together a book. Oh, we're going to do a book together. And then Eddie decided he didn't want to do it. He had to shelve that whole thing. And only recently that stuff has come out. Yeah, there definitely is a lot of drama. There's the wars between the lead singers. There's the substance abuse and all that stuff. So there's a lot of skeletons in those closets, right? We are going to be seeing an Alex autobiography shortly, which is pretty cool. That's neat to see. But even the hints of that ahead of time, he seems to be downplaying expectations of it, of what it's going to be like. So I don't know. It's maybe the secrecy is going to continue. The only one that doesn't seem to be all that guarded about things is Sammy. When Sammy talks about stuff, he's pretty direct about it because Sammy's just a good communicator and a regular dude. He's kept the friendship up with Mikey. David Lee Roth doesn't talk a lot, and if he does, it's super interesting. It's always interesting.
Indecipherable.
Yeah, but yeah, there are definitely a lot of stories with this band. And this book is essentially, the idea around it is it's a mandate that this publisher has had. It was their idea. And we've done a few. I've done AC/DC at 50, Kiss at 50. I've done Bowie at 75. But the idea is to write about 50 career milestones, and they could be happy ones or sad ones or whatever. So these aren't particularly they aren't interview intensive books. They're more like picking these events and laying them out chronologically and having these very tightly written, because you got to worry about word count as well. Having these tightly written, swiftly moving, self-contained passages on the various dramas all along the way of the career.
You mentioned a few minutes ago your love of music dating back to your childhood. Mm-hmm. Van Halen formed. Actually, the band itself had many iterations before they made it big. Different bases, different names. Mm-hmm. Brought in Roth as the lead singer. List goes on. When did you become aware of Van Halen, and what did you think of them the first time you heard their music?
I totally remember that like it was yesterday. I would have been 15 years old in 1978, getting that debut album. And I remember me and my buddy Forrest Hoop got it back to his parents' place from downtown, Trail, BC, little town in British Columbia, and put it on. And the funny thing is, we were both crazy music fans, so I was already well tapped in. For some reason, we even knew about this band on some level. It might have been a couple of advance ads or whatever, but I remember playing it, and our initial thoughts were, okay, there's a lot of wasted space here. I don't particularly appreciate Ice Cream Man. I don't particularly appreciate that guitar solo. I don't appreciate a Kinks cover. I don't like Little Dreamer. I don't like Feel Your Love Tonight. Jamie's Crying ain't heavy enough. Running with the Devil ain't heavy enough. But I definitely remember us thinking, wow, I'm the one, On Fire, Atomic Punk, Ain't Talking About Love. These are songs that are as good as the Judas Priest and Scorpions and Rainbow songs we like. These are the only songs we've heard from an American band that sound as good as the European bands. So we know I had a feeling of the variety of the album, but it felt like a lot of filler. But you could tell it was gorgeously recorded. It was incredibly performed. This did not sound like a baby band. We knew about We had compared against all the American bands, though, it seemed like they were just a little smarter than all of them. Aerosmith, Ted Nugent, Kiss, Derringer, Ram Jam, Montrose, Gamma. Oh, Gamma wasn't out yet. Gamma is 79. But so all of those bands, none of them, Yesterday and Today is a good example because they're like the Van Halen that should have been, right? You think of the Struck Down album, it's almost like the blueprint for Van Halen 2, not particularly Van Halen 1, but Van Halen 2 almost, right? But this, like I say, it felt like there were flashes of brilliance here that were as good as Judas Priest and Scorpions. That's how we saw it.
And so you mentioned that there were certain songs on Van Halen 1, which was released, I believe, in February 10th, is it 1978? Yep.
Same day as Judas Priest Stained Class.
So you've mentioned some songs that you don't like, and you have an interesting take on all their albums. As I was reading it going, this guy doesn't have a clue. How the hell can he not like this song? Come on, man. Yeah. But has your opinion changed about Van Halen 1? Some of the songs you may have considered filler back in 1978. How do you feel about them now?
Yeah, somewhat more, but it hasn't changed a lot. The ones in particular, I would say Jamie's Crying and Run with the Devil have coming up in estimation. Obviously, I now know the importance of Eruption, but I remember as a kid at 15, it's, you got a guitar solo, you named it. Okay, it's really cool, but it's just a guitar solo. We were angry young metalheads who just wanted metal, and it had to have vocals too. But I've learned over the years also is that just the pacing and the sequencing and the professionalism of it, and decades go by, and there's really not too many debut albums that are better than that, right? As a debut, it is really professional. And that's the other thought I've always had about that record after getting the rest of the Van Halen catalog, is that it's actually the most professional, detailed, conservatively recorded, put together, reasoned album of the entire catalog. Because after Van Halen 1, they turn into The Who, basically, right? They are this band of explosive chemistry between these personalities, and they're just flying off the cuff for everything they do. It's spontaneous and it's explosive. But that first album is really the only one where, there's no Brown sound yet. There's no whatever you want to define the Brown sound as. On Van Halen 1, it's just really professionally, corporately recorded and put together. So that's the other funny thing over time. It's like they never made a more professional album ever again. That was the most professional album they ever made.
Eddie was the one who always defined the Brown sound as Alex's snare and him wanting to try to tune to complement Alex's snare. But you're right or let's go back to Eruption. Now, especially when you read the tributes when Eddie died, I think October of 2020, and the guitarists, rock, metal, country, who stated Eruption as a true watershed in guitar playing, in guitar sound. Do you agree with them in the sense in all of your studies? Do you say, look, if Steve Vai says this is a complete game changer, then it's a complete game changer?
Okay, so what I would say about that is, no question, Eddie becomes a new kind of more extreme and more hysterical and ridiculous and important version of that, the definition of that term guitar hero. I really almost don't even feel like, looking back, there are any guitar heroes from all of the 70s that you would put between Eddie Van Halen and Jimi Hendrix. So when Steve Vai says that, in the back of his mind, subconsciously or unconsciously, what he's really saying is Eddie started an industry that I was the second or third in line of, and I've had a great life because of it. So he started the guitar hero industry. It's Eddie, then it's like maybe Joe Satriani and Steve Vai, basically, and then a bunch of guys below them. But so by doing a guitar solo like that, naming it, and having a new trick, tapping, to stick into it, I don't think there's anything about the sound of it that's particularly important. Guitar sound is a weird thing to discuss. It's a strange thing because it's happening essentially on one frequency, right? It's some variation of the term mid-rangey, right? So guitar sound and tone is a very obscure thing to discuss, right? It's such a small space of sound real estate that it takes up. But yeah, just the idea of him doing that. And then also what happened is that, of course, DJs would play it before you got into You Really Got Me. So it was showing up on the radio as an intro, which is really cool. So yeah, essentially what he did is he became the next guitar hero after Jimi Hendrix.
And it was ballsy to put it as the second track on the whole album.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah. It's short enough and it leads into a song really nicely. And it is really a piece of music, a musical piece of music. It's like I said, the other guys in Hendrix's days that were considered guitar heroes were not all that super crazy exciting. You know, Eric Clapton and Jeff Beck at that time, particularly, or eventually Jimmy Page. In the 70s, had Jimmy Page and Richie Blackmore and Michael Schenker and these guys. But it was more about the songs they put together and the great riffs combined with their soloing, right?
You mentioned, I had a few people say Van Halen at 50. Van Halen's not 50. The first album didn't come out till 78, but they did play. They actually, in some ways, if you read different books, especially Greg Renoff's superb book, how they created or capitalized, hyperbolized the club scene. But famously, before they were signed by Ted Templeman or signed by Warner Brothers, they did this demo for Gene Simmons of Kiss when Kiss was at its absolute apex. So anything Kiss was going to generate a ton of publicity. You mentioned that just a little bit in your book. Do you find that fascinating, or is it just one of those things that happened but didn't happen?
Yeah, I find that whole area or that whole era fascinating because this is a band that paid their dues in a very strange way. It's almost like in a Twisted Sister way, where Twisted Sister were like the big fish in the small pond. Van Halen, paid their dues, doing well and coming up in the business, but essentially being able to live at home and not going out on tour and not being the low on the totem pole support band and all that kind of stuff. So we call it Van Halen at 50 because you could pretty accurately pick 1974 at some point in 1974 as the start of the band. But you're right. Along the way, the next kind of biggest thing that happens is Gene and Paul see them and take them under their wing a little bit. And a demo gets recorded. And then Bill Aucoin actually passed on them. And what would have happened? Maybe we wouldn't have heard as much about Van Halen. The cream will rise to the top. But had they been on shoestring running Casablanca Records, we might not have heard. And might they have moved to New York? Might they have left this great industry cauldron that they were sitting in? Ted Templeman, Warner Brothers, there's nothing more LA than Ted Templeman and Warner Brothers. And Van Halen's from there. And so everything worked amazing. But the other funny thing about that is Bill Aucoin is passing on them and the locals are passing on them too. They're casting aspersions that David Lee Roth is a little behind the times and he's based on Jim Dandy and they're playing all these old obscure rock tunes that nobody knows because they're acting like DJs, right? They love taking their obscure record collection to the people, right? By covering all these weird bands like Budgie and deep cut Black Sabbath songs and Mountain and stuff like that. And Captain Beyond, a new cool bootleg just showed up on YouTube. 4 songs from 1974 and they cover Captain Beyond there, which is really cool. But
Eddie said they wanted to be a junior Cream, but then realized they couldn't make any money.
Yeah. And they were an entertaining band, but they were, like I say, playing all these obscure covers. But so the funny thing is they're coming up and they're almost like people are getting tired of them at one point, just being around all the time. And then all of a sudden punk rock's coming around and new wave's coming around. And is this old long haired, bushy mustache rock and roll from essentially 73, 74. It's even in 76, 77, they still sound like a 74, 75 kind of a band. So it was never easy for them. It wasn't easy because they didn't get signed and get going when they would have been absolutely super exciting to everybody, say 73, 74. They're having all these fits and starts and it's not really taken off for them, but fortunately everything works out. And then by the time they get signed and get the record out, they're finished paying their dues. They go on tour and they blow away Black Sabbath and all that stuff. And that album just takes off like a rocket. And they have stopped paying their dues. It's like Black Sabbath really didn't pay a lot of dues in 1970. They were famously famous right away because they had something super interesting. And Van Halen really didn't have a lot super interesting and new. They're just really good at a whole bunch of things that already existed and like way beyond their years. They were like old souls at being a fireworks, pyrotechnic, hard rock, and heavy metal band. And yeah, then it just took off.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is music author Martin Popoff. We're discussing his new book, beautifully written, wonderful pictures, really strong narrative, sir. I enjoyed it. I read it in a day because it's such a fun read. Van Halen at 50. Van Halen at 50. You mentioned Van Halen's initial tours, Black Sabbath, Journey, Montrose. How did their performances on stage not only help their first album take off, but solidify them as a premier American, if not the premier American rock and roll group?
I think you definitely had this guitarist that was blowing a lot of people away. The guitarists took notice right away. He had flash. It looked easy enough. It looked effortless. It's the things that he would integrate into his playing. Like he could play licks as part of riffs and stuff as well. So he just had this conversation going with the neck of the guitar. The songs were really good. The songs were varied. Like I say about that debut album, there's a lot of different speeds on it. There's some space in some of the songs. Jamie's Crying and Running with the Devil both have a lot of space. So even with a bad PA, those are going to come across really good. And then of course you've got this great front man who's got all the confidence in the world, looks great. The whole band looks great. Mikey's looking a little behind the times, I think, still at that point. But yeah, the drum, yeah, they look like just absolute rock and roll wild men. Unfortunately for Black Sabbath, Van Halen is absolutely out there on fire, and Black Sabbath's in their tired phase. The Never Say Die album does not go over that well. And there are these little stories along the way of Van Halen picking up pointers from Black Sabbath and copying some of their moves. And Tony even takes them aside and say, don't copy me. But yeah, I guess the other thing, Robert, is they have honed their skills for more than 4 years, essentially. And they're just really good at what they do because they played a lot of gigs at this point. So they're just deceptively a baby band. The people all over America don't know about them yet. And they're hearing this, like I say, super professionally recorded album on a major label promoted. I remember there were a lot of ads for it and stuff as well. So yeah, they're not really a baby band. They know what they're doing.
You mentioned Bill Aucoin a few minutes ago. I should have clarified he was the manager of Kiss. Jim Dandy, to whom Roth gets compared. I don't think it's a compliment, but I don't know that it's necessarily an insult. But Jim Dandy was the lead singer of a group called Black Oak, Arkansas. When I had Greg Renoff on the podcast, and I also had a chance to ask him this, and I'd like to really get your opinion on it. How much, let me see if I can ask this correct. How responsible for Van Halen's success was the female audience?
Wow.
You see that video in Unchained, and the women are just going crazy over if it's not their greatest song, it's in the top 5 by everybody. That's not a love song by any stretch of the imagination. And the women, the girls in the audience simply can't get enough. Was that something else that separated Van Halen from groups like, say, Judas Priest?
That's a really interesting question, because now with the wheels turning in my head, I'm thinking, okay, so on record, let's leave the concert out of it for a second. On record, they instantly, by record 2, they've got Beautiful Girls, they've got Women in Love, they've got You're No Good. So they're coming up with some ballad type things or some poppier type things. They're finding some success on radio. I still feel though, Robert, like if I was just to think very abstractly about the opinion people have of Van Halen, now this is another interesting thing about him, but I still feel like they were a guy's band. So I don't know if they had that massive female audience. I can't picture. I've never heard anybody say they had an uncommon amount of women in the crowd either. I'm sure it was better than a Judas Priest crowd or whatever, or a Scorpions crowd or an Ozzy Osbourne crowd, like more women than men. But I still feel like they were like a badass guys band. I just think the music was a little bit too wild. And then as we go into the third album, Women and Children First and Fair Warning, I'm still feeling like there aren't a lot of songs there that I can picture that had a big connection with the women. Now, as you move into the next one, you do get Jump, I'll Wait, Girl Gone. I don't know. Panama. I still feel like it's obviously they're a good looking band and Eddie's smiling and Dave's got his hairy chest showing and all that stuff. But I've never, like I say, you're taking me by surprise with this question, but I almost feel like off the top of my head, I almost feel like one of the main reasons or only reasons we associate women with the band is probably the label trying to push that in the videos. But I just don't feel like there are a whole lot of women with a lot of Van Halen records.
Van Halen went on tour. They did very well. They had these follow-up albums, which were more than that. Van Halen 2, Women and Children First, Fair Warning. Let me ask you about Fair Warning before we move on, because we want to make sure we're judicious with everybody's time today. Mm-hmm. Fair Warning is the favorite album of Van Halen's among so many musicians that when you ask them in interviews, I did an interview. Actually, I did 2 interviews with Brad Tolinski. He used to be the editor of Guitar World and wrote a book about Van Halen, and one about Jimmy Page. He came on to discuss both. Why do you think Van Halen's Fair Warning stands out so much in their catalog?
You know what, Robert? Here's a funny thing about Van Halen. We've talked about this on some of our podcast and YouTube channel things that we've done. There are certain bands in this world where, for whatever reason, it's neither good nor bad. It's just how it pans out. That there are bands where there is no consensus what the best album by that band is. And I think Van Halen is that band. So you're right. Fair Warning does come up a lot. And my theory is very simple. It's got Unchained and Mean Street on it. People basically think of those 2 songs as 2 of the greatest Van Halen songs ever. And they say, oh, Fair Warning's got to be the best album. But there's a lot of stuff on there that nobody pays any attention to. Push Comes to Shove, So This Is Love, Sunday Afternoon in the Park. Sinner Swing is even forgotten about. Hear about it later, nobody thinks about.
One Foot Out the Door is masterful. It's such a blistering solo.
I know, but it's still a deep track. We all love it. Deep fans love it to death, right? Dirty.
we want every song. We want every song to be When the Levee Breaks.
Yeah. But the funny thing about Van Halen, I've gone back and forth over and over again about what my favorite album is. Currently, it's 1984, and I can argue for it. But I've said Women and Children First before. Most people lean to the debut. There's a few Sammy Hagar fans out there who will pick a Sammy album. But this band, another band like that is UFO, where people have a hard time picking the favorite. Even Deep Purple, oddly enough, because Deep Purple, I picked Perfect Strangers as my perfect Deep Purple album, and people go into shock. And then you said, what's yours? And they'll name it, and you'll go, okay, what about this song and this song? They'll go, you're right, I only 4 to 7. So that's the funny thing. There are these Van Halen's exactly like that. When you start going through these albums, Van Halen fans are great complainers, right? So when you go through these albums, every Van Halen fan will start looking at them and go, yeah, you're right. There's 3.5 Virgin on 4 songs. I don't like very much on this thing.
So much of it is when you grew up, right? Like I was born in 1967. So 1984 was the first Van Halen experience that I had. But my brother was born in 1960 and he can remember, he was I see this behind you. My brother Michael was a monster Yes fan, huge. Yeah. But when Van Halen came out, he was like, man, what in the world is this? What is this guitar playing? And here's a guy who's been listening to Steve Howe for the previous 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
But let me ask you about some band dynamics real quick. Michael and Alex. Michael Anthony, if he's not the most underrated, overlooked, unappreciated person in modern rock and roll, if he's not, he gets my nomination. What did Michael Anthony bring to the band?
I think he brought good nature more than anything else. He brought those backing vocals, which are incredible. The bass playing, the live bass playing, especially he always got a great sound. He was a great showman on stage as well. But on the albums, he's not particularly told or allowed to do much. I think the band would have liked to have had him write more and contribute more, and then there wouldn't have been the big war they had over writing credits.
Yeah,
we know
they
Eddie.
did. Let me stop you right there, please. Forgive me, because they did have that war where, and I think Eddie did an interview in the early 80s where he's really harsh about, this is way before the Roth breakup and in the subsequent Van Halen soap opera involving Sammy, but Eddie's just harsh about Michael Anthony. I don't know, when he gets asked the question like, what was Michael's contribution or something, and I think Michael said, I don't know, or Eddie said, oh, he went to Disneyland or something. He's very dismissive. I asked Brad Tolinsky about this, and he says, well, as much as Eddie says he wished Michael would have done more, he goes, I don't know about that. Maybe that's just something Eddie's saying because Eddie wanted control of the process and the music. So forgive me for saying that, but it seems to me that you make the point in your book about Michael Anthony participating more, but at the same time, it doesn't seem like he was allowed to participate more.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't think he was particularly anybody wanted him to play busier, but I have a feeling that, I think it's an instructive thing for someone in the music industry, because this happened with Deep Purple as well. Richie eventually got very resentful about the other guys not writing songs, John Lord in particular, or Ian Pace for that matter. And then having to split the songwriting credits 5 ways. And Van Halen had the same thing going. So I think it's an instructive thing. It's try writing. It's going to be fun. It's going to be satisfying for you. You're going to make more money out of the band. Your band is going to like you more. So it's almost get into that writing process. Do not be afraid to be part of the writing process, because your bandmates aren't geniuses. It's not that they're way above you. I think people probably feel unconfident about it. And I think Eddie would have liked his band to write more and contribute more. Sure, he wants to be the control freak of the band or whatever, but I just, judging from how short the albums were and how they became so few and far between, it's not that they had just this vast profusion of songwriting pouring out of them all the time either.
And it's also a situation, is it fair to say, and I devour all things Van Halen as much as I can because it was such a big part of my childhood, that Eddie could take an attitude with Michael that he couldn't take or wouldn't take with his brother Alex.
Yeah, that's an absolutely great point, because they would fight overtly, as there almost has to be an extra layer of politeness when it's not your brother kind of thing between them. Yeah. And then unfairly to Michael, it's Eddie should have had the exact same complaints about Alex. Why aren't you writing more as well? Granted, exactly. Drummer apparently can't write, but if that's not true, drummers can absolutely write. So yeah, it's funny that way, but you're right. There are 2 people who did not write there, and fair game to Dave got in there and wrote lyrics and wrote good lyrics. So
the dynamic between Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth, and I try to be nice to Roth since he's a Hoosier like me, is so endlessly fascinating. When you read the Ted Templeman biography that was written by Greg Renoff, co-authored, he and Don Landy speak openly, Templeman does, of getting rid of Roth and sticking in Sammy Hagar for the first album. One of the greatest what ifs, not involving a death, in all of rock music history. What did Roth bring to the band? And would you agree with Templeman's quote that if he had replaced Roth with Hagar back in the 70s, he would have been making the biggest mistake in music history?
Let's address that first. Those what if questions are always a little silly, because obviously he has the hindsight of realizing Van Halen became a pretty big band with David Lee Roth, right? Would they have succeeded with Sammy? I bet they still would have succeeded, but the world would have been bereft of any David Lee Roth. We wouldn't have gotten David Lee Roth, or it might have been on a much smaller scale. But what did David bring to the band? I'll tell you, going back to hearing that album for the first time, we had no idea about any of the complaints about him being an inaccurate singer, because we thought he sang great on that album. So all credit to Don and Ted for coaxing him through the process. It was a lot of work getting those vocals down, but they're great. But I listen to old demos and stuff. For example, this show from 1974, Dave sounds pretty good on it. He's still a wild man, and it's 1974 and it's live in a club, so you don't expect him to be great, but he was fine. But yeah, we have heard those stories. What he does bring to the band. So number one, I thought he had a really interesting voice. he almost could play that voice the same way Eddie could play guitar, in that Eddie's having a conversation with the neck of his guitar, and David could throw in licks between the lyrics, riffs, licks, yelps, conversational things. So right off the bat, when you heard that album and the following albums and you saw what he looked like, you thought, this guy's the leader of the band, or a leader of the band, right? But you have the cognitive dissonance that the name of the band is Van Halen, but David Lee Roth sounds like a pretty authoritative name in itself, right? And he looks like the leader. He looks athletic. With that face and his jawbone and all that, and the look on his face, he looks older than the other guys as well. So I remember always feeling there was a little bit of a Bon Scott vibe to him, right? Like he's the tough guy in the band. So he's the leader. You feel he might be a little older, had that absolute confidence in and of this front man. So I think that's what he brings to the band. He is on stage. He is the circus barker. He looks around him. There's other players and knows, you guys are awesome, and I'm just going to be just as awesome as you guys are. We've got a great thing going here, and he leads that party, and we know he's a good lyricist as well. But yeah, I think his performance on all those records is, like I say, a little bit like Eddie, where he had a bunch of tools in his toolbox, and he was good with vocal phrasing. He was a bluesy singer. He could add vocal fry and subtract vocal fry. So I think he brought a ton to the table.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmond Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. Our guest today is renowned music journalist and author Martin Popoff. We are discussing his new book, Van Halen at 50. Eddie Van Halen and David Lee Roth. How did the success of 1984, in a lot of ways, their breakout album, or not, that's that breakout, not breakthrough, maybe, but it sold, dominated MTV, had these videos, ended up selling more than 10 million copies. How did 1984 signal the end of the first iteration of the band?
I think it might have given Dave the slight mental illness of an enlarged ego. I think his ego just got bigger and bigger because he looks
LSD.
That's what Eddie called it.
Lead singer disease.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He looked great in those videos. He's leading this band that's bigger than ever. He's thinking, oh, I can be a movie star. I suppose he gets some of that because of the success of the videos. So yeah, it's funny. Breakout or breakthrough album, or it's like their return to fame album in essence, because things went downhill for 3 albums, right? The excitement level had worn off a little bit of Van Halen. The sales were not particularly high. They were just settling in as one of the biggest bands in the world, but maybe not the biggest. But yeah, 1984, they're like ruling the roost, right? And that record, we left out Diver Down. There's Diver Down in there as well, setting things up. So that is actually starting the return. The famous disdain from Eddie over the covers on the album, Dancing in the Street and Pretty Woman and all that. But this now has no covers on it. It's all originals. It's full of hits. Jump, Panama, Hot for Teacher, I'll Wait. They're all hits. And then everything else on it gets played on the radio as well. So basically radio's playing the whole thing. So yeah, I think his personality maybe just got bigger and bigger. I suppose Eddie now has gotten his way again with having originals and not being so cover based as they were on the previous album, which turned out to be a good idea that the label and Dave were in agreement on. So now we're getting the rift as well. Dave and the label were proven right on Diver Down that, hey, you can have a successful album and turn it around. And Eddie wants to make his own music and all that. And then we have the other rift starting to happen where, what are these keyboards? And then Dave, of course, goes off and wants to do Crazy from the Heat, just completely cheesy, schmaltzy, ridiculous EP of nonsense.
But is it fair to say the cliche, timing is everything, but MTV blowing up in the early to mid 80s, coinciding with Van Halen and David Lee Roth blowing up in the early to mid 80s, isn't a coincidence. They were made for each other. David Lee Roth was made for MTV.
Absolutely. Yeah. He was an entertainer. You hear about his past, how he loved TV, right? And he loved just the idea of entertainers from any sort of field. So he was great on there. I'm picturing with the top hat, the dancing girls and all that kind of stuff. So they are made for MTV. Granted, this is a couple years into MTV, but yeah, they're probably pretty much at their height. MTV starts in the summer of 81, but they're massive by the end of 83 and into 84, 85. You're right. The timing is exact. But Eddie's smiling away and the big flashy drum sets. And yeah, they actually navigated the ridiculous clothes of the era where they even had kind of hair metal-y clothes. But you look back at all their clothes before Sammy arrives, you look back at their clothes in the hair metal era. They're only at the beginning with Dave at the beginning of the hair metal era, but they don't screw it up. They actually look pretty good. So they don't look particularly ridiculous. I suppose the most ridiculous clothes come in that 85, 86, 87 period with other bands, but even Van Halen navigates that pretty good. Sammy, unfortunately, navigates it good, but in a bad way. He's trying to go for that sort of upscale hair metal look that Rush also did. And it actually looks more ridiculous or as ridiculous as true hair metal clothes as worn by Kiss, for example.
Let me ask you one other question about before we move on to Sammy, because we're going to give him short shrift because we don't have a ton of time left. But the marriage between Eddie Van Halen and Valerie Bertinelli, it gets written a lot about, especially now that Eddie has passed, especially when it comes to the dynamic between Roth and Van Halen in the overall sort of realm of celebrity. Do you sense, what's your opinion, that the marriage, how the marriage played into the breakup and the tensions and all of that? Is it overplayed, underplayed, about right?
I've heard a few people bring that up, and I'm always a little surprised about it because I remember living through it and barely paying it any notice at all. So to me, I feel like it's overplayed.
In 1985, Roth leads the band. In 1985-86, Van Halen begins to work with Sammy Hagar. In the spring semester of my senior year of high school, they released 5150. What is your opinion of that album? And how would you rate the transformation, the change in the band, not only in lead singers, but sound and songs? It happens so unbelievably rarely that you replace someone like David Lee Roth in a band. You bring in someone else. Sammy Hagar had a fine career, right? But he wasn't Billy Joel. And they produce an album that goes to number one, their first number one. Is that astonishing to you at all as a music historian?
That's probably the most positive thing I could say about it, is that it's not astonishing to me as a music historian because it's a great story. It's literally like Ronnie joining Black Sabbath or Brian Johnson joining AC/DC. It's like a massive music story. You can't ignore it. And this is a huge band. And Sammy's coming in with this great history of something like 10 studio albums by then. Long career, legendary. He's on the Montrose album, one of the greatest albums of all time, the first Montrose. So he's coming in. He's got stature just like them. So he's one of the few guys who could join and rub shoulders with these guys and be a leader. He's a great leader on stage. He's got a lot of confidence. He's got an amazing voice. Now that record, so at the time I was not very impressed with it. I'm still not that impressed with it. I've got two main complaints about it. Yeah, I've got two complaints about it. I feel like now when they write lighter, poppier songs, I really don't like the chord changes. They're getting really schmaltzy and poppy sounding, very corporate, mainstreamy sounding. That's almost the wrong term, because the thing I love about it is that I think the sound on that album is so radical and strange and very Brown soundy to me, as taken in snare drum, bass drum, Eddie's sound, a lot of things about even the cymbals, right? It's a cool radical recording. So I like the fact that it doesn't sound like any other albums from the 80s. The other complaint I have about it is that I find, and this is what I thought the day it came out, there are songs on there that just sound like they're barely written, like Best of Both Worlds, good enough. On the other hand, Why Can't This Be Love is just a masterpiece of pop songwriting. I think that's really good. And I like a fair bit of the rest of it as well. But yeah, the lyrics are pretty phoned in on that album, and even the music on. I hate Best of Both Worlds. I've always hated that song, and Good Enough as well. They just feel like they're jams, right? So there's too much just jamming on that album.
Oh, my heart. If I had told you in, let's say, the fall of 1984 or the spring of 85, hey, guess what, Martin? David Lee Roth's going to leave Van Halen. And Van Halen is going to replace Roth with Sammy Hagar. And they're going to have 4 consecutive #1 studio albums and sell tens of millions of copies. And David Lee Roth is going to sink into relative obscurity. You would have said,
it wouldn't have been surprising to me, because Van Halen has the brand. They're still amazing. They're making music that is even more commercially accessible than before. That means commercial success. And like I say, Sammy looks great. He sings great. He's a perfect addition to this band. So they're firing on all cylinders. And you're right. I remember at the time thinking, these guys are all about as big as each other still, David Lee Roth and Van Halen. But yeah, they went from, I think it's double platinum Freedom and Smile, or maybe just platinum down to gold, maybe, or is it double down to platinum? Anyways, for Skyscraper. But and then after that, there's a long break, and then the next one only goes gold, right? Little Ain't Enough. But you're right, the obscurity. He still does okay as a solo artist, but yeah, you would have thought that would have been bigger, but then he makes the strange decision of he goes and makes a Van Halen band on steroids, essentially.
Oh, the first Eat 'Em and Smile. I love Eat 'Em and Smile as an album. The band is obviously terrific. And as you said, on steroids. Roth's career famously starts to crater.
Yeah.
But the Sammy Hagar edition of Van Halen, despite 4 #1 albums, tens of millions of records, hundreds, if not thousands, sold out concerts, they still can't keep it together. So now Van Halen's looking for a new lead singer. Yeah. At that point, does it just become a reductio ad absurdum? As a journalist or a historian, are you like, what the hell are you guys doing? How can you not get along? This is starting to be farcical.
Yeah, so you're getting the dirty laundry, and that's casting a pall, putting a black cloud on the band. So that's bothering you. And then they hire a guy. It sounds like they're hiring a guy, and who is somewhat Sammy Hagar adjacent of voice. And then they try to make him sing more like Sammy Hagar. And we knew even then that this bringing in this guy from Boston doesn't quite make sense in this California band. And then they make an album again, which is very underwritten, doesn't really have songs, or the songs are really radical on it. It's not very heavy either. The album cover's not very good. So all of a sudden, yeah, everything's going against them. That happens because they're being managed by Ray Daniels out of Toronto, who is also managing Extreme. And so it just seemed easy to put these guys together. But there wasn't a philosophical match there at all, I don't think.
I agree with Sharon that you very well could be correct. I agree with Sharon's later, and he wasn't the only one to say it, Gary Sharon, the third lead singer of Van Halen, that they should have just toured and given everyone a chance to hear the old songs with Gary singing them, because Hagar was famously reluctant to sing raw songs, or at least sing more of them, or different ones. I remember reading an article where I didn't ask him to sing more, just let's sing some different ones. And I remember on the Hagar Van Halen live, when they toured after their live album here in Indianapolis, they played Unchained in the audience, about, I don't know how many orgasms in 20,000 audience, but there was plenty of them. You get into Sharon, and he thinks,
Robert, was that with Gary or with Sammy?
No, it's when Sammy toured, when Van Halen toured after the Right Here, Right Now live album.
All right.
They played Unchained at the concert, and everybody just freaked out. They just wanted that little bit. Give us some different songs, because we love all your songs, Sammy. Sharon's point of, we should have just toured, then I could have sang 10 Roth songs and 10 Hagar songs and then recorded an album. To me, that would have been, things may not have been that much different, but they could have been somewhat different. Mm-hmm. And Van Halen 3 is obviously not at all what Eddie's looking for in terms of popularity and sales. Mm-hmm. Eddie descends even more into darkness and addiction, and is literally has his life saved by his son Wolfgang. When you and you write about all the eras of Van Halen in your book, Van Halen at 50, we're with music journalist Martin Popoff. I think it's pretty clear that not only did Wolfgang Van Halen save Van Halen the band, but he saved Eddie Van Halen's life.
Yeah, absolutely. Wolfgang deserves a lot of credit. Number one, he's possibly, arguably more talented than his dad, even because he's such a multi-instrumentalist and he can do a lot of that stuff. And he's the next generation. It's not surprising. The younger kids, it's not a slight on Eddie. Records, even in rock and roll, are meant to be broken. And we know just from watching YouTube videos of 8-year-old Japanese girls, right? Playing guitar,
playing drums, or
whatever.
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly. So it's not a slight on Eddie, but it's really commendable that Wolfgang is just one of today's musical geniuses, and literally almost using the mathematical objective version of that term genius, right? But yes, he saves dad. He saves the album. He's like the musical director probably of that album. Doesn't get enough credit for it. It's one of the great bass playing Van Halen albums. It's super heavy, right? And yeah, that surprised the heck out of everybody because, you know, all of us metalheads, it's just so ironic and surprising to all of us that out of all the bands who ever came back with a way heavier album and surprised you and delighted you that they did that, no one expected Van Halen to be one of those bands because they're from California. They're on a major label. They're massive. All this drama, all this baggage of the label's going to want to have hits. They were never one of the heaviest bands in the world. So there's all these little examples we have of this over time, but none of them stand up to a different kind of truth in terms of the amount of heaviness and how heavy that album was.
Going back to a famous event, what was your thoughts when Van Halen, Anthony, and Roth walked on that stage for the MTV Music Awards? When you saw them all together again?
Yeah, that's pretty funny. And then it all falls apart because
it falls apart that night.
Yeah, one of them is just still too much of a ham and wanting to hog the spotlight. And yeah, you really see the dynamic there too of the other guys, you know, particularly Alex and Eddie, just being like private, soft-spoken guys, right? People talk about them as being kind of sweethearts, or at least Eddie, and almost naive and
introverts and that sort of thing. And certainly Alex is. It's interesting that, to your point at the beginning of the podcast, it's almost ironic that Alex is the one writing an autobiography when he is, I think, clearly the most publicity shy person in the band and has been from day one.
Yeah. And Eddie had his other kind of quote unquote problem which is he just became such a madman gearhead, right? He loved gear. His thoughts on gear and building guitars and dealing with amps and just tinkering at 5150 caused there to be less albums out in the world from this band. So he's just such a creative that it's almost like he chose that medium and said, I'm not making records. That doesn't matter. I'm making guitars. I'm soldering, man. This is my creativity now, right?
That's a great point, because Eddie Van Halen does get so much credit, not only from like guitar players who bloomed in the 80s, but from people like Les Paul. I'm convinced that Les Paul is the famous guitar player and builder and designer who passed away several years ago. I'm convinced that Les Paul is the only person in the history of the world who's been kissed by both Eddie Van Halen and Paul McCartney.
Nice.
There's videos on YouTube and you can see it. It's so hysterical. Last question before we get to the 5 questions we ask all of our guests. The apotheosis of Van Halen's place in American culture, to me, is when at the end of Fast Times at Ridgemont High, Jeff Spicoli hires Van Halen to play at his birthday party with the money he's received. I think he saved someone from drowning or whatever.
Yeah.
But take a minute or so and we've talked about Van Halen in the music world, their problems, that sort of thing, their influence. Talk to the Leaders and Legends audience, please, about Van Halen's place in popular American culture the past 50 years.
Wow. When you said what is the peak of their cultural penetration, the first thing that came to mind for me was the Jump video, actually. But their place is, so we talked about before, I honestly don't think there are the short list of guitar heroes. If you wanted to have a brutally short list of guitar heroes, because you can make a list of any length, right? But if you wanted to have a brutally short list, there's two. There's Jimi Hendrix and Eddie Van Halen. That's it. So that's a good short list. You would never make a list of one, for example. It would always have to be at least those two, right? So that's cool.
Great. Great point.
Yeah.
You can't think of one without the other, even though Van Halen says I'm a Clapton guy, not a Hendrix guy. And Clapton treats Van Halen like dirt, according to Valerie Bertinelli. But you're right. It is one of those things where if you say Hendrix, then you have to say Van Halen and vice versa.
Exactly. Yeah. It's all those hits as well. But I'll tell you something, Robert, that I'm starting to hear squawkings about Van Halen. Among the deep Van Halen scholars, actually, this might be because we seem to have a genetic tendency to complain. Van Halen fans are hostile, but what I've heard them say is that they're afraid that Van Halen is on the chopping block of radio playlists, that they will slowly be forgotten over time, that they possibly are already starting to be marginalized into at least that second tier. Even on satellite radio, I hear them all the time. I'm just saying, if you add all of it up, right? Add just the collective world Godhead consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. That Van Halen is slowly being, their memory is slowly being chipped away with. But I don't particularly see that yet. I just think it's an interesting theory. This book has sold quite well, and all of my Van Halen stuff people keep bringing it up, and I'm on Facebook all the time, and Eddie's always talked about. So I don't see it happening, but I find that whole thing fascinating about how the 60s playlist went from 100 bands to 20 to 5, and doing the same thing with the 70s. But yeah, the Van Halen scholars are saying Van Halen is being excised out of public consciousness slowly.
We have to work really hard to make sure that never happens.
Absolutely.
If only to get you to change your mind about Hot for Teacher.
Yeah.
We have reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Martin Popoff, are you ready?
Okay, let's try it.
What was you'll love the second question. Anyway, the first question, what was your first job?
Oh, this is actually a pretty good one, and it's related. I worked in a stereo and record store and TV store called Rock Island Records and Tapes. Hang on, Rock Island. Anyways, Rock Island. And right in downtown Trail, started working there at this store at 14, 15 years old, hauling console TVs up and down from the basement and all that stuff. Thank God we didn't wreck our backs doing that or kill ourselves. I also got to very quickly run the record department, right? Ordering records, stock the record department. So yeah, 14, 15 started working. And my other funny first job was I was the mower and water of the local graveyard. And I would have to go down at 5 a.m, get up, bike down there, open the big metal door up and reach down with the thing and turn the sprinkler on. I wouldn't mow the lawn at 5 a.m, but yeah, so I used to have to go down there and do that. There's 2 heavy metal jobs for you.
Wow, Mr. Crowley.
Yeah.
Number 2, what was your first concert?
First concert of any consequence, because I grew up in a small town, Trail, BC. Dad took me, my brother, and a buddy down to Spokane, Washington, which was our closest big scary American town, right? 2 hours, 15 minutes directly south of Trail, and saw Rex backing up Bebop Deluxe, backing up Ted Nugent on the Free For All tour, 76.
Loudest concert I've ever been to, Ted Nugent here in Indianapolis in the 90s. At a certain point, you just couldn't take it any longer. You had to go.
Yeah.
Number 3, if you could recommend any book for someone to read, which book would you suggest?
Do you mean of one of mine? Or
no, it can be one of yours.
Any book. Wow, boy, I'm looking around my office here. There's books all over the place. That's you floored me with that one because I'm a massive reader. Okay, I'm going to give you a really weird one. Phil Baker wrote a biography of the great occult surrealist artist from the early 20th century called Austin Osman Spare. It's the definitive book on Austin Osman Spare. I'm a complete Austin Osman Spare freak, but it's the definitive biography of Austin Osman Spare by Phil Baker.
a completely unique choice that I am sure that we have not yet heard and will not hear again. But good for you. Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Wow. How about the Toronto Maple Leafs winning another Stanley Cup? I guess I would say the 1967, 66. It's been a long time. It's one of those 2 years, the last time they ever won the Stanley Cup. But yeah.
Be there at the winning game?
Yeah, boy. I don't know why I leaned to sports on this, but I have been there for both of the downtown, both of the times the Jays won the World Series. And we are long-suffering Bills fans up here, believe it.
I'm a Dolphins fan.
Crazy. Oh, yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Even where you're from. Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Last, you can stay with your sports answer. Do you want to give another one? A lot of people
I'll stay with that. Answers.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Wow. Possibly Roger Waters. I've got rock and roll in the brain all the time. People often ask me, who have you not interviewed with yet that you'd want to interview? And he always comes to mind really high up. Brian May as well.
Yeah. Brian May's a huge Van Halen fan. Huge.
Yeah. Yeah. They did that Starfleet thing. Ridiculous.
May said it's the pinnacle of guitar playing in our lifetime.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I just always find the logic of too much going down that road to romanticize people that happen to be famous and are really good, because as we discussed earlier, it's just my jaw is constantly on the floor just watching people who never made a record in their lives be the greatest musician I've ever seen, right? On YouTube or TikTok, right? I mean,
amazing talent. Amazing talent.
Yeah. It's almost, there's a rapid evolution of the human brain taking place or something that nobody's really talked about.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, Martin Popoff, world-famous, best-selling music journalist and historian. We have spent the last hour discussing his latest book. It is terrific. You can pick it up on Amazon or anywhere that you choose to get your books. Van Halen at 50. And trust me, you'll know about whom this book is written by the cover. The cover art is beautiful. Thank you so much, Mr. Popoff, for coming on the podcast.
Yes, thank you, Robert. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.